Dearly beloved, of all of the anniversaries and milestone dates that have come and gone during this pandemic, the two COVID Easters have been the hardest for me to wrap my head around. Last year, I felt like I'd walked through a wardrobe into a strange world when I contemplated the reality that we would not be worshiping together in person on Resurrection Sunday. Well, this year, I've grown a little bit more used to the idea of online celebration, but still, I would have been polite about it, but I would have judged you to be a bit over the top and given to paranoia if on, let's say, Christmas of 2019, you had told me that we would miss 2 Easters in a row, that we'd all be wearing masks, that the death toll in the United States would surpass 500,000 people in 12 months, that we'd be conducting church business on Zoom, and that I would end up preaching with a teleprompter as I am now. Yet here we are. The geography of COVID normal is indeed a strange and unexpected landscape. Before writing this sermon, I watched last year's Easter sermon video, and well, there are some things that have changed. For example, I've gotten much better at making sermon videos. Still, there are things that have not changed. A year ago, I was pretty sure that we'd be past the pandemic by July, and I still believe that, though I have changed the July in which I have placed my hope for life beyond the pandemic. In last year's Easter sermon, I stood here in front of my newly leafed apple tree, and I used the tender new leaves as a metaphor for resurrection. I pointed out that sometimes when we say Christ is risen, Christ is risen indeed. By the way, that's an edit I could not have done last Easter. But sometimes when we say Christ is risen, Christ is risen indeed. It is a promise. It is forward-looking faith. Just as the leaves on the tree and the blossoms that will follow the leaves are promises that life goes on and that the world, like Jesus, arises from its slumber, so also we will rise up in this life and in the next because Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. It is a promise. It is forward-looking faith. Just as the leaves on the tree and the blossoms that will follow the leaves are promises that life goes on and that the world, like Jesus, arises from its slumber, so also we will rise up in this life and in the next because Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. This Easter promise is not just in the past, and it may not be in the present, but resurrection, renewal, rebirth, victory over any number of deaths, big and small, will, in the fullness of time, be a reality among us. Well, that was last year's sermon, and I still believe it. But a year on, I have also learned that sometimes resurrection takes effort and work and grit and resolve. To borrow and to mangle a line from one of Wendell Berry's poems, resurrection takes practice. I think that may be why 1750 years ago, the Christian church added a line to its earliest official creeds that spoke of Jesus descending into hell between his crucifixion and his resurrection. That is not a story that is found in the Bible. It is, however, a belief that goes back to the earliest years of the Christian tradition, a time when faith was being informed to some extent by Greco-Roman mythology, such as, in this case, stories about Persephone and Orpheus. And I think this belief in Jesus' descent into hell is part of traditional Christian belief because it acknowledges that sometimes anyway, resurrection is really hard work. Or if you will allow me a quote from A River Runs Through It, that great Calvinist novel written by Norman Maclean, who introduces his father, a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman, by saying, "My father was very sure about certain matters pertaining to the universe. To him, all good things, trout as well as eternal salvation, come by grace. And grace comes by art, and art does not come easy." Sometimes new life, resurrection life, comes in ways that feel magic. But not always. Sometimes the practice of resurrection takes us to hell and back. But that hard work doesn't make resurrection less powerful or less real. Take, for example, the year that has just passed. In my resurrection sermon last year, I said resurrection would come in time. And I was right about that. We're still waiting, and I'm convinced we will emerge victorious from this season of pandemic, but it is taking a lot of work. I had no idea how hard it is to stay home all the time, how challenging it is to live a life through the screen on my computer, to remember a mask every time I walk out the front door, to delay the gratification of spending time with loved ones who live outside of Alameda County. It is hard. It's too hard for some of us, which is why the pandemic is dragging on and hitting the United States in such tragic numbers. Not everyone believes they have the strength to practice resurrection. But Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. And the promise is that we too can be strong, and that where we are weak, the power of God's creative and redemptive and life-giving love will support us. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. There still is so much work to be done as we seek to walk out of COVID's sepulcher. So many of us have yet to be vaccinated, and that's no easy chore. Now, I stayed up till early in the morning of April 1st so that I could get a vaccine appointment the minute I became eligible. I was hoping I could get in somewhere quickly and nearby. And it looks like I'll be getting my first vaccine dose next Friday in Yuba City. It will be kind of a long drive, but sometimes resurrection takes work. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Now, I realize that the need for resurrection in our lives will outlive the pandemic. And I hope next year's Easter sermon is very different than the COVID Easter sermons that I have recorded. But for now, I pray that you will stay strong and stay committed and stay engaged in the work of resurrection that will have us embracing old friends and singing praises to the living God together as we worship together in celebration on the right bank of Temescal Creek. May that day come quickly, but until it does, stay strong and keep practicing the work of resurrection. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Amen.